Okay, $1 trillion. I really want you to let that number sink in for a second, right out of the gate. It is a massive, almost incomprehensible amount of money, and it represents the current annual run rate for interest payments alone on the United States national debt. It absolutely sets a dramatic, high-stakes tone for everything we're about to get into today.
Because that staggering number leads us right into a pretty terrifying but honestly crucial question. Is America heading for a financial heart attack? Today, we are framing our entire analysis around the systemic risks of sovereign debt and what actually happens when the fundamental math of a superpower simply stops working.
Welcome to today's Explainer. We are going to break down the highly polarizing intersection of sweeping new tax policies and looming fiscal cliffs. And we're doing it using the absolute latest macro-financial data to give you the clearest picture possible of the American crossroads.
Okay, let's dive right into part one, the trillion-dollar interest bill.
To really understand where we're going, we have to grasp the staggering macroeconomic reality of a $38.5 trillion national debt. This newly updated baseline from the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office paints a very clear picture. The CBO projects that federal debt will reach an unprecedented 136.4% of GDP by 2036. To put that into perspective, that is literally higher than the debt load in the immediate aftermath of World War II. And, the trajectory is pointing straight up.
Let's walk through the compounding math of this because it is moving fast. Our current debt sits at $38.5 trillion. In fiscal year 2026 alone, the deficit is projected at $1.9 trillion, which is about 5.8% of our entire GDP. But I really want you to pay close attention to the interest costs. Interest consumed just 9% of federal revenue in 2021. By 2026, it jumps to 19%, and by 2036, it's projected to hit a staggering 26% of all federal revenue. It's rapidly eating up the federal budget from the inside out.
So the crucial point here, the real so what of all this data is this. Over the next 10 years, for every single dollar the federal government borrows, 66 cents will go simply to pay interest on the national debt. Not going to roads, not to schools, not to the military. Just interest. It perfectly illustrates exactly how the vicious cycle of debt compounding works in practice.
Moving on to part two, the One Big Beautiful Act.
This brings us to the recent 2025 legislative policy response, which is an incredibly ambitious fiscal experiment. Let's impartially look at the two realities of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or OBBA. On one side, we have the White House's promise. They project a highly pro-growth environment driven by permanent business expensing, no taxes on tips or overtime, and new senior deductions. They estimate this could boost GDP by up to 4.9%. But on the flip side, macroeconomists at the CBO, the Brookings Institution, and rating agencies like Moody's are issuing some severe fiscal warnings. They're projecting a massive 45-point bump to the debt-to-GDP ratio, adding $4 to $6 trillion to the deficits over the next 10 years.
And this brilliantly illustrates the administration's argument. This mathematical modeling from the Council of Economic Advisors projects that these business tax provisions are going to unleash capital, driving a massive surge in business investment by up to 7.3% over 4 years. Their core argument is that this will ultimately raise overall economic output and directly pay dividends for the American worker.
However, shifting back to the perspective of the CBO and Brookings, we have to look at the structural fiscal consequences of all this. They point out that this massive tax cut package adds 0.5% of GDP to the primary deficit annually, and that's before interest is even factored in. The corporate tax breaks heavily outweigh the proposed spending cuts, which puts immense pressure on future federal budgets. It opens the door for accelerated credit rating downgrades and, crucially, it reduces the tax revenues that are currently keeping our vital trust funds afloat.
Which brings us to part three, the Social Security benefit cliff.
Now, what's really interesting, and frankly a bit scary about this, is where the math hits home for everyday Americans. We're pivoting from the broader budget to specific entitlement programs. When analyzing the latest Social Security income projections, you can literally trace the exact moment where program costs drastically overtake incoming revenue. Because of our aging population and changing demographics, those trust fund reserves are being forced into rapid depletion.
So here is the peril, clearly defined. Fiscal year 2032. That is when the Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund is projected to completely exhaust. And when that happens, by law, retirees face a devastating 28% across-the-board drop in benefits. And because of the recent legislative tax cuts that reduced incoming revenue, this date has actually been pulled even closer to the present.
Let's look at Part 4, Medicare's accelerating insolvency clock.
Because it's not just retirement checks we're talking about. Healthcare is on this exact same terrifying trajectory. There's a profound irony in these recent policy moves. The OBBBA gave seniors a new $6,000 tax deduction today. That sounds great, right? But the resulting loss of trust fund revenue actually accelerated the Medicare Part A insolvency date to 2032. This means seniors are facing an impending 11% cut in hospital benefits just a few short years down the road.
Let's move to map this all out and see how this builds into a ticking clock. In 2027, the $41.1 trillion debt ceiling limit re-enters the chat. By 2032 and 2033, both the Social Security and Medicare Part A trust funds are totally exhausted. And by 2036, the national debt reaches 136.4% of GDP. Notice how these massive crises stack up and hit the economy entirely within a single decade. It's like a fiscal traffic jam.
Zooming out, let's hit Part 5, Global Risks and Systemic Shock. So, why does an American budget problem matter to the rest of the planet? Because American insolvency is quite literally a planetary threat. To truly grasp this, we have to look at Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. This theory basically states that long periods of economic stability breed complacency. That complacency leads to excessive leverage, speculative financing, and eventually collapse. By relying on ultra-low interest rates to build up debt over the last decade, the U.S. government has arguably shifted from safe financing to, well, almost Ponzi-like borrowing, where it has to borrow new money just to pay off the interest on its old debt.
Now, economists are totally split on how this actually plays out. Modern monetary theory, or MMT, argues that because the U.S. issues its own currency, it can just print money to pay its debts. For them, the only real constraint is inflation. Traditional orthodoxy, however, warns that these high debt-to-GDP ratios inevitably crowd out private investment and lead to either ruinous inflation or a severe financial crisis.
And if the traditional orthodox guys hit the nail on the head, well, look at this number. $730 trillion. That is the sheer, mind-boggling notional value of the global over-the-counter derivatives market. These are the financial bets tied directly to this system. If a U.S. debt default were to ever actually occur, it could detonate these financial weapons of mass destruction, causing immediate and devastating global contagion.
Which brings us to our final section, Part 6, a financial heart attack? When you synthesize all of this, the OBB deficits, the looming entitlement cliffs, the massive weight of global leverage, it brings us right back to the simple, broken math of the U.S. balance sheet. Listen to how legendary investor Ray Dalio puts it. He states, the government will spend about $7 trillion, and it will take in about $5 trillion. The debt is now about 6 times the amount of money it takes in. It is a stark, unsustainable reality that the global market is acutely aware of.
And to really hammer home the urgency here, I want you to think about Dornbusch's law, which is frequently cited by economist Larry Summers. It goes, financial crises take longer than expected to arrive, but then happen faster than thought possible. Just because a crisis hasn't happened yet absolutely does not mean the system isn't incredibly fragile right now.
So, what does this all mean for us moving forward? I want to leave you with this provocative, lingering thought to deeply ponder. Will the U.S. dollar retain its exorbitant privilege, or are we witnessing the dawn of a distressed sovereign issuer? The math is ticking, the cliffs are approaching, and the entire global financial system is watching closely. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.